Now that we've covered random error, confounding and bias, we're going to return to case control studies because I want to talk about matching, and matching makes a lot more sense when we've studied these other topics. So what is matching? So matching basically involves selecting a control group which matches in terms of certain potentially strong confounding factors, usually just age and sex. It matches the distribution in the case group, so that we have a control group and a case group with similar distributions with these particular confounders. Sometimes this is referred to as having good confounder overlap, but that's not a term you hear very much, but in case you do, that's what it means. It's rare in cohort studies for matching to take place, and I'll explain why in my next talk. So the commonly expressed purpose of matching is to eliminate or reduce confounding. And it does this in case control studies by eliminating the relationship between the confounding factor and the outcome, the health outcome. So it does that, and you've seen this slide before, simply by just eliminating this, and it does that by making the two outcome groups, which is the case group and the control group, very much the same in terms of the distribution of confounding factors. So there's no association, in other words, between the outcome and the confounding factor. And that must be the case if the distributions in the two groups are made much the same. So now there are two types of matching, and one of them is called frequency matching, and this is where you simply make sure that sort of overall the control group and the case group are similar in terms of the distribution of these matching factors. So in other words, a sort of similar proportion of males and females in both groups, similar distributions of ages in both groups, but there's individuals in the two groups are not kind of in any way linked. But that's not the case with individual matching, the other sort of matching. And this is where when you obtain a case for your study, you then select some controls. You may just select one, or you may select maybe up to four, say, who are similar in terms of the matching factors. So we'll give you some examples to explain that. But basically, we do it one by one. And in practice, that we actually use individual matching quite frequently because of the type of control selection procedure that we favor. And if you'll remember this from a previous talk, where and it represents incidence density sampling of controls. And so the cases come along at a certain rate, and we select our controls at an approximately the same rate. So we're selecting our controls out of the same person-time experience. And practically, the way we do this is by sort of matching each control to the corresponding case in terms of our matching factors. So it's a common way to go about it. Now, paradoxically, although we use matching to eliminate confounding, we also, in matching, we actually introduce a new confounding structure into our data, which we'll have to take into account. So the new confounding being introduced by the matching is always towards the null. And that doesn't matter whether there was really confounding in the original data set or not, or which direction it was in. You're always going to introduce confounding that biases the result towards the null. And we have to take that into account. So why does the matching cause confounding? So the reason is because we match a confounding factor must be correlated with the exposure of interest, the exposure that we're looking at. So it's correlated, and if we make our case and control group similar in terms of these confounding factors, then just because of the correlation between the exposure and the confounder, we're necessarily going to make the two groups more similar. And so by making the two groups more similar, we're going to kind of push the relative risk estimate or odds ratio towards the null. And if in fact we had perfect exposure confounder correlation, now if it was exact every level of the exposure of interest correspond to a particular specific level of a confounder. We'd have a perfect correlation, an r squared of 1 for those of you who've done some statistics, and this would completely move the odds ratio, say, for the exposure of interest to the null. We would have perfect correlation, so the odds ratio we would get would be 1, basically. So to deal with the introduced confounding, we need to use an appropriate data analysis. So we need to take into account the matching variables either as stratification variables or as terms in our logistic regression analysis if we're going to do a multivariate analysis. But a downside of that is that the odds ratios for the matching variables are not interpretable. They don't really mean anything because they've been artificially created by the matching process. So there are 3 reasons that you might consider using matching. The one that everybody seems to cite most of the time is control of confounding, but there are a couple of others: elimination of selection bias and improvement of data analysis efficiency. So I'm going to talk about each one of these separately. So I think I've largely covered why we eliminate confounding by matching, by removing that correlation with the outcome. But a point I really want to make here is, for the most part, matching is not necessary to eliminate confounding. So provided we've got a decent sample size, then simply by carrying out a stratified analysis or a multivariate analysis and taking into account the confounding factor, we can completely take care of any confounding that may be occurring. So it's often not necessary, but it can be useful if, say, we want to match on neighbourhood and we think that there are some important but unknown confounding factors associated with neighbourhood. These could be something to do with socioeconomic status, and so by matching on neighbourhood we can effectively take that into account. The second one is elimination of selection bias, and this is very similar to eliminating confounding by unknown neighbourhood-related factors. So, but it's the situation that we would use this to eliminate selection bias is particularly, say for example, we had a hospital case group, and we can't be really sure of what the secondary base population is that generated that case group. But one way to kind of replicate or sample from that secondary base is, for example, to use neighbourhood controls. So basically we would be matching our case group, hospital case groups, say, on neighbourhood controls. So this is a form of matching, and it helps in that instance to eliminate selection bias. The third reason why we might carry out matching is to improve the efficiency of our data analysis, and often this is actually the main benefit of matching in case control studies, but not one that people are aware of very often, and not one that's often mentioned. So the problem can be that if you have a case group and you end up with a control group, an unmatched control group, which and such that the case and control groups have very different distribution of these important confounding factors, then we would say that the groups are unbalanced in relation to confounding factors, and this actually has the effect of widening the confidence intervals. So we get less precise measures of association with wider confidence intervals. But by matching, we can actually often overcome this problem and narrow the confidence intervals somewhat. So sort of situations that this might apply, as I've mentioned, when the case and control groups have very different distributions of confounding factors. So an example here which I think hopefully will be intuitively obvious. So if you have a case control study when the cases are all aged 20 to 40 and the controls cover a wider range, 20 to 60. Now the problem is that these controls, these older controls, contribute relatively little, if anything, to the data analysis, and so that the confidence intervals would be wider than if, say, you had ensured that all the controls were aged 20 to 40. The next one is when you only have a few cases, and so as you know that there's not much to be gained by having more than, say, up to 4, maybe 5 cases, controls for each case. So if you have few cases, and then you're probably going to have really more, but still few controls. And if you select your controls somewhat randomly, or at least without taking into account important confounding factors, then you may end up with a sort of distribution that we just showed you, where the case group is very different, say, in age to the control group. So in this situation, which is related to the previous one, it makes good sense to, because you're only going to have relatively few participants in your study, it makes good sense to match your controls to your cases in terms of these important confounding factors. In that way, basically, you maximize the efficiency of your data analysis, given that you've only got a few participants in the study. So let's illustrate this issue of how we can increase the efficiency of our analysis, how we can narrow our confidence intervals. So these are some data, and so this is all about hip fracture, and we have an exposure, and what that is not important for the sake of this example, but say we have an exposure, so some people are exposed and some not exposed. Now we stratify our sample in terms of those who are older than 70 and those who are younger than 70. And if we simply select controls without regard to the age distribution, then we might end up with something like this. So we have a situation here. We've got twice as many cases in the older stratum, twice as many cases as controls. But even worse, in the younger stratum, we have 16 times as many controls as we have cases. So this is really unbalanced in terms of the age distributions of both the case and the control groups. So as you know, we're not going to get much extra bang for the buck by having 16 cases, 16 controls per case. So anyway, but we carry out our analysis and we get an odds ratio of 4, and the 95% confidence interval would be 1.9 to 8.4. However, if we were to match our case group, still maintaining this what is a 1 to 2 ratio of cases to controls, but if we were to match on age, we might end up with something like this. So we have in both the two strata, the two age strata, we have a 2 to 1 ratio of controls to cases, 2 to 1. So we're not spending a lot of resources getting a lot of young controls who are not really contributing a lot to the analysis, particularly when there's only relatively few cases, as is the case, hip fracture being very much related to age. So we've balanced the cases and controls in regards to the age distribution. Then we carry out the analysis. Again, we get the same odds ratio and or the same relative risk odds ratio, and there's no reason why we shouldn't, because there's actually no bias inherent in having an unbalanced control group relative to the cases. There's no bias in that, but there is a reduction in precision. So if you look at the corresponding confidence interval, you can see that it's actually narrower. We've got a more precise measure, even though the odds ratio itself is exactly the same. So this just illustrates, using exactly the same number of controls in the two groups, how making it more balanced in terms of an important confounding factor can actually improve the precision of your results. Okay, now another example, and this is actually a real example, one that I was involved in when I lived in New Zealand in the 1990s, and New Zealand had a major problem of meningococcal disease caused by this disease agent Neisseria meningitidis, and it was a serious problem, very high case fatality rate. In other words, a high proportion of people who were infected with this agent died, and the thing is that most of the cases were in young children, less than 8 years old. So this was actually 2/3 of all the cases that can occur in older people, but mainly in young people. Now, in the New Zealand population, it was disproportionately distributed across the different ethnic groups. So the Maori people, the indigenous people of New Zealand, had a rate of 300 per 100,000 person years in this young age group. But the Pacific Island people who lived in New Zealand, who came from islands such as Tonga and Samoa and so on, they had more than twice the rate of the Maori people. But the others, the majority of people in New Zealand being of European ethnicity, they're a much lower rate, 50 per 100,000 person years. Now, but if you look at the proportions of the children in the population, you see that the others, mainly, as I say, mainly of European parentage, were 60%, Maori and Pacific Island around 20% each. So, we wanted to carry out a case control study to determine what were the risk factors for this disease, because at the time there was no vaccine, so it was hoped that we could identify other risk factors which would lead to other interventions. So, but the problem was the distribution, the rates was very different to the distribution of proportions of children in the population. So you can fairly easily calculate that if you just take the distribution of cases that occurs in the population, which is easily calculable from the rates and the proportions of children, and then if you calculate the distributions of controls, which would simply reflect the proportions of the children in populations, if you were to randomly sample, then you can see this is what we would have got. And so you can see this is very unbalanced. So you can see only a small proportion of the controls would be Maori or Pacific Island, but the great majority of the cases would come from those groups. And we would get most of our controls, if we just sampled randomly, from the others group, but only 13% of the cases. So this would have led to a very inefficient study. So it was appropriate in this instance to match the controls to cases in terms of ethnicity. So that was the problem of the potentially unmatched case and control groups. But a second problem was that the Maori and Pacific Island families were somewhat less likely to have a telephone. So that could have actually, if we were to recruit controls by telephone, that could actually have potentially exaggerated that problem. We would have ended up with an even higher proportion of control children from the others group. So the solution that was implemented after a lot of discussion was to use door-to-door sampling, door-to-door knocking, and a sampling method based on the number of households and the ethnic distribution across census units. And using this method, we got a frequency match sample of controls, which is based on the age and ethnicity distribution of the cases. So this was a practical situation where it really was necessary to use some sort of matching method, which improved the efficiency and also, or particularly improved the efficiency of the data analysis. And speaking of efficiency, there's two ways to view efficiency. So you can think of efficiency in terms of the amount of information per subject enrolled in your study. We'd call that size efficiency. And pretty well, matching is always beneficial. On the other hand, though, it costs money to match very often, because you have to actually screen a bunch of potential participants till you find one that fits in with your criteria. And if you think about it in cost terms, matching may be very inefficient, because it may cost so much more to recruit, to screen a bunch of potential controls, and then just to find the ones that you want. So in terms of unit cost or cost efficiency, matching may not be the best way to go. So, and you need to always bear in mind that an alternative which may turn out to be more cost efficient is actually just to recruit a larger number of unmatched controls rather than spending potentially a lot of money identifying matched subjects. And that's the sort of trade-off that you need to think about when you're designing a study, which way to go, to match or not to match. And I find that students, this is one of the things that perplexes students most often when they're trying to set up or design a case control study, should they match or not. And so the purpose of this talk, and also the one that's coming next, we're going to be talking about some of the disadvantages, among other things, of matching. But the next talk will be basically a continuation of this talk, also mainly focusing on matching.